Okay, guys, here's our presentation for religious traditions and patterns of life in South Asia. We're going to start with religious traditions. We're going to start with Hindu beliefs. These are the basic Hindu beliefs. Hinduism is the most common religion in India. It has no founder and no formal church. The religion developed out of ancient Aryan beliefs. They have many sacred texts that record their beliefs. The most important are the Vedas and the Upanishads. Try saying that 5 times fast. Hindu beliefs also show up in many ancient stories and epics. Hindu gods. The Hindus believed in thousands of gods. There were gods for everything. Right? Each god was part of a single supreme being called the Brahmin. You should recognize that as one of the castes from our caste system that we talked about the other day. It's our highest caste, known as the priest. Brahmin can only be understood by a few, and Brahmin is nameless, formless, and unlimited. It's not really a thing, and even though they call it Brahmin, it doesn't actually have a name. The other gods make him concrete and easier for others to understand. So if you were what they considered not very smart, you would worship these other lesser gods because you could understand that more easily. There's 3 main gods that they worship. Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer, and a warrior god. Sorry about that. There we go. Sects. A sect is a religious group. There are many different sects that worship Hinduism, or that are Hindu, and each sect tends to worship a different god. So you can imagine how many different sects that would be, just thousands and thousands. They believe in something called the essential self. They call it the Atman, and it is part of the universal soul. So they believe that all life is connected to this universal soul. To them, the Atman and the Brahman are the same thing. Okay, so the Brahman is a universal soul that everyone's connected to. This leads to the idea of reincarnation. And reincarnation is that when you die, your soul comes back as something or someone else. So you can come back as a flower or a cricket or even a god. The reason that people suffer, according to Hinduism, is the result of sin from previous lives. So if you're born, say, as an untouchable, the lowest caste, it means you sinned very badly in the previous life. Ultimately, they try and reach moksha, right, or the freeing of the soul to unite with the Brahman. And if you finally reach that, you will not be reincarnated anymore. Okay? They also believe in karma. This is where karma comes from. And it's the belief that every deed, either physical or mental, affects the fate of a future life. Okay, so when we say, hey, that's karma, that's actually what we were talking about. The caste system. We've talked about the caste system before. Here's some more information. Karma and reincarnation are connected to the caste system. Once you're born to a caste, you stay that caste for life. When you're reborn, you can change caste depending on how good or bad you are. So if you're good, you're going to move up the system. If you're bad, you're going to move down the system. Each caste has its own duties or dharma that they must perform. So depending on what caste you are, depends on what you're supposed to do. It dictates your job, and it dictates what you can do for fun. It dictates what you eat, all kinds of other things. A part of dharma is that you follow caste rules and moral codes. Okay, so you're supposed to live a moral life. If you do that, you can move up the caste system when you die. So now we're going to talk about Buddhist beliefs. So they believe in the 4 noble truths. These are the foundation of Buddhism. And the first noble truth is that everyone suffers from pain, sickness, and death. The second is that the cause of suffering is desire. Number 3, the only way to end suffering is to crush desire. The only way to end desire is to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. The history of Buddhism. Buddhism was started when in about 600 BC, the Brahmin caste was controlling the Hindu faith. They were telling people that they could only sacrifice to gods if these Brahmin did special rituals, and they were really being quite mean to the lower caste people, and they were telling the people that they were going to end up being a lower caste. Okay? A man named Siddhartha Gupta tried to limit their power. So he really tried to help stop them from being quite so powerful. He grew up very rich and happy, however, and he did not see suffering until he was a grown man. He lived inside the walls of his palace, and then as a grown man, he finally left them, and he saw a beggar and a blind man and a dead man all very, very close together as soon as he left his gates, and he realized that there was a lot of suffering in the world. So he left his family to search for the cause of suffering and the cure for suffering. He found them while meditating under a sacred tree, and he, after that, was called the Buddha, or the Enlightened One. And at that point, that's when he created or came up with the Four Noble Truths. Teachings. These are the Buddhist teachings. Buddhists are always striving for the Third Noble Truth, trying to crush desire. They're able to do this by successfully, or when they're able to do this successfully, they will reach nirvana, or the condition of not wanting anything. Okay? Hindus do not believe in any gods, and that priests are not necessary. That's a response to the fact of the Brahmin priests trying to be in control of everything. The Buddha also rejected the caste system. As with Hinduism, there are many sects in Buddhism. There are two main sects of Buddhism, the Theravada, who do not worship Buddha as God, and the Mahayana, who do worship Buddha as God, and anyone else who has been able to reach enlightenment. That's the main difference between those two major sects. Okay, so we're going to talk about other traditions, or religious traditions. There's Jainism, which grew out of the efforts to reform Hinduism. Islam, as we've already spoken about a little bit, was also a popular religion, though it faded during the Mughal Empire. And there's Sikhism, is a combination of Islam and Buddhism that emerged in the 1500s and has a small following in India today. Now let's talk about some patterns of life. So first is the caste system, and we've already learned quite a bit about the caste system, but here's even more information. The caste system is very important in India if you hadn't figured that out yet. We talked the other day about the four varna of the Aryan society, and we talked also about the touchables, or the untouchables in class. Can you remember what those four castes are? Write those down on a blank A, B, C, and D if you can remember them. Okay, let's go over them. They're the Brahmins, and the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the Vatsyas, the Sudras, and then the one that's not listed there is the untouchables. The caste system developed over many years until there were thousands of castes and subcastes. Every job was its own caste, and then if you had like a specialty in a certain job, so say you were an artist, that was a caste, and then if you were a painter, that was a subcaste. So each different thing had its own caste or subcaste. And then each caste had a set of rules that they had to follow. We talked about those a little bit. The rules were very complex, and the higher up in society you were, the higher caste you were, the more stricter rules were. The rules helped you keep your spiritual purity, and if you came in contact with a lower class or caste, that caused you to become spiritually impure, so you would avoid other castes. The rules covered everything from cooking and eating to marriage and employment, so they dictated who you could marry. You could only marry people from your caste. And the rules, though, created a very stable society that was interdependent of each other. Since each caste or subcaste had a job, you all had to do your own job in order for society to work. If you were a merchant, you had to have the caste that was their job was to bring water. You had to have them in order for you to function because you were not allowed to bring water. That was the caste. So everyone had a job, and it made for a very stable society. Okay, let's talk about village life. Most people lived in villages that were governed by headmen. Villages could range in size anything from a few dozen people to being the size of cities. I'm sorry, that should say cities, not leaders. Villages were normally self-sufficient of each other. In most villages, either one person or just a few people owned most of the land, so the rest of the people would work on the land, essentially renting it, and then would have to give part of their harvest to the landlord as payment. Most people owned cattle, and we've talked about how cattle were important in Aryan society. They were used for transportation, for plowing, for their milk, and they also produced an oil called ghee that was used for cooking, and it was very useful in the hot temperatures of this area because it has no fat in it, so it doesn't spoil when it gets hot. Okay, family life. The ideal Indian family was a joint family. So this is where parents, children, and grandchildren all lived together. And we've talked about that a little bit with previous societies, and we talked about it with the African societies, how multiple generations would live in one home. The families were patriarchal, which means they were ruled by the males. We've talked about this as well. So if you were the oldest male, you were in charge of the family. They always put family first. The whole idea behind their belief is that family comes first. So marriages were a part of that, and marriages were for the benefit of the family, not for those that you loved, but you were to benefit the family with your marriage. Girls were expected. It was hard to have girls because you had to pay a dowry, and the richer you were and the higher you were in the caste system, the more expensive that dowry was. And oftentimes men and women did not meet until the day of their wedding. And women were married very young, somewhere between 12 and 15 usually. And then their husbands were oftentimes twice their age. So their husbands would be much older. Women's lives. Women really had very few rights. They continue to have very few rights in India today. We'll talk about that later on as we study this area. Their duties were to marry, care for their husbands, and bear sons. They do, however, possess something that men didn't, and it's the Shakti, or the creative energy. And males are considered incomplete unless they have married, because they do not have it. Women were expected to obey men. And higher women would often live in purdah, or complete seclusion. They'd wear veils over their faces, and they would almost never leave their houses. If a woman was widowed, she would be expected to give up all the comforts of life and spend all of her time praying. This was hard on a lot of women, particularly women who were of upper castes, because they had to give up all of the nice things that they were used to. And so many women, instead of choosing to live that life of hardship, what they would do is they would throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. And the funeral pyre is where you burn the body. You build up a bunch of wood, and you create like a platform, and you put the body on it, and then you set it on fire. So women would go and they would throw themselves on the fire in order to kill themselves as well, as opposed to live in hardship. These women were given a special place, though. They were called the Santi, or virtuous women, and it cleansed both themselves and their husbands of their sins. And that is all for today. If you need to go back, you can either go back in this video or you can download the Prezi to your iPad and you can look at it that way as well.